So I feel very honored to be here today with all these speakers from all around the world. I think it's a fantastic concept, Monica. Um, to basically now turn on Keynote. Just a minute. Share my screen. All right. Do you see the real presenter slides or the? You see it correctly? Hello.
Yes, you're good.
Sorry.
You're good. You're good. You
Good.
can
All
see
good.
the
We're looking at it. Great.
All right. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Welcome. I wanted to talk to you about involvement being the new engagement. And since this is all about education at GameCon 48V, we'll look specifically at this idea of game thinking and how it can be applied to education. And today I will share with you my quest in becoming a better educator myself by applying what I've learned from games and play. And I will share with you what works and doesn't work when trying to create an optimal learning experience for students. So let's get into it. Well, a quick introduction. I am a lecturer in gamification and game thinking at Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences for over a decade now. In fact, yesterday I received a voucher to celebrate my 12 and a half years as a teacher, which I immediately spent on books and games. I am also a game thinking consultant, and I have helped many organizations develop applied games and gamified engagement strategies. So, for instance, in this example, you see how I helped the Rotterdam City Library to develop a game that initiates a dialogue on moral dilemmas. It's for kids between 10 and 15 years old, in the spirit of the famous Dutch philosopher Erasmus. And I'm here demonstrating it to the King of the Netherlands. This is my space, and I surround myself with everything I can get my hands on about playing games. So I got about 500 board games, 1,000 video games, 1,500 books on everything related to games, play, and motivation. And from these, I harvest a wide variety of ideas that I apply in workshop formats and that I use as a designer and as a consultant. And so I call myself a game thinker, which we'll get into later, because I basically look at everything in life as a game. I mean, that doesn't mean that, life is a game you can just put a new quarter in when you die, although there are some people that believe you level up after death. But apart from that, it's not that I think life is a game, but I just look at it as if it were a game, so through the lens of a game designer. Apart from that, I also like to be playful, and I see play opportunities everywhere around me. So, as at PlaySpacer on Instagram, I provide myself with an alibi for play wherever I go. Now, before I geek out and start telling you about the book I'm currently reading about the Inuit morality play, in which, actually very fascinating, parents go outside with their children and let them do the worst behavior ever as play, when they're calm, and then to figure out, have a dialogue about why or not that is nice to people before they go back to the community where they actually never fight. Very fascinating. Anyway, but before I geek out here, um, I can tell you I've been studying this for ages now, but I am always on the lookout for new things we can learn from games and play. And so today it's my pleasure to share some of what I've learned with you. So let's go back to the basics here, because I'm talking to you today as educational professionals, and I'm sure you're interested in how to uplift your profession. And by now, we've all heard of games, obviously, and it's being implemented in the context of education for a few years now. We've seen serious games, we've seen gamification. Now I'm coming here to talk to you about game thinking. And they seem like these shiny new things that will solve all our problems, right? Um, but let's go and start with some basic definitions of these shiny things. So, serious games. Serious games are entertaining games with serious non-entertainment goals. Now, what's an example of that? For instance, SimCity Education. Um, this is where you play as a mayor and you go through certain missions. For instance, this simulation asks students to lower pollution and increase jobs. So the immediate feedback that each student gets on their actions makes it a lot more fun and inviting than, waiting for the teacher to grade your papers and hand it back to you the next week. This immediate feedback loop makes it very inviting to also try out different strategies to achieve your goal, to take a risk, try different things. So that's an example of a serious game. Now, what is gamification then? Now, gamification isn't creating a game, but it's actually using game elements in a non-game context. So here's an example, which is a very typical example, I think, of what I see a lot online these days in education, if it's gamified. So this is not a game you're looking at. It's basically a class overview with tasks that students must do in order to pass. And it has all these game elements, right? Like points, badges, leaderboards. And this appeals to students because it reminds them of the fun games they already love to play. And it looks a lot less boring than most online class environments. That is for sure. And as it often goes in education, we've been quick to implement these new things, serious games, gamification. But I have to give fair warning. Once you do the research, you will also find out that there are some things that are a little bit sketchy. And so before I tell you more about game thinking, I want to go into some of the unintended consequences that we can see when we apply gamification and serious games immediately into education. Number one, we just looked at this example, right, of SimCity Education Edition. So let's have a closer look. The thing is, a simulation game is, of course, a simplification of real life. But life is more complicated than a game. And you could argue that simulations can never really model our messy reality. They can only simplify it. And that comes at a disadvantage because often the game's objective is based on specific norms built into the system. For instance, the norms of what a city should be. And if you look at SimCity, both the educational version as the original version, it is built around the idea that a city is car-centered, that everything has to be done by, connected with cars. And the player is never actually invited to question this, which leads to some strange objectives. For instance, in this mission objective from SimCity Educational, students must lower the air pollution, but yet they cannot question the goal of economic growth, leading to quite questionable advice of the game to the player, because the game advises the students to simply add more roads for cars to drive to work. And you want to get rid of pollution, but you have to add more cars. And one may wonder if that is a lesson to be taught. So that's the first one of unintended consequences that we have to be aware of. The second one, if we look at gamification, is that it is easy to fall into the trap of making something look like a fun game, yet not actually creating something that is structurally game. So making it look like a fun game does not necessarily mean that it will be a fun experience. And in this example, you can see all these things, right? You see these flags, badges, etc. It looks very much like a game. But if you take a real good look at this, this is what is really happening. So these are different examples from that picture we just saw, where we use different visuals and words to basically describe good old education as it already exists. So class being a world, grades we call points. If it's a grade overview, we call it a leaderboard. To-do list becomes badges. Study progress is unlocking levels. And the final test is, of course, always called the final boss level. But, the wrapper around education may look like fun, but what is inside the box is still structurally the same education as the way we had it. So we have to be aware that can happen if we're too fast to just use the visuals of games and apply them to education. The third unintended consequence. This is a typical sort of abstract image of a lot of gamification applications in education. And we see again here, we see some stars, levels, we see timers, we see targets, we see rewards. Yet, not all game elements are desirable in education. The fact that a game element can be fun in a game for entertainment purposes doesn't mean that it makes for a fun educational experience. Or, let's put it another way, it will not necessarily lead to a better learning experience. And some of these that you now see are actually already included in education for decades. They're nothing new, like points have always been there. And I think we should have a closer look at that. So if we take, for instance, reward and punishment, which we see a lot, rewards, awards, what is up with them? Do they really work in education? We've had them for decades, but do they work? Alfie Kohn tends to disagree. I mean, he says, do rewards motivate people? Absolutely. But they will only motivate people to get rewards. If you take away the rewards, there's not much else that motivates them. It's actually a very often used example of how rewards actually can kill a person's intrinsic motivation. I don't know if you've heard this one before, but there was a story about a professor. I can't remember exactly who explained it. And so this professor had kids playing in his backyard and he hated it. He wanted them out. So, he tried cursing at them. He tried, pleading, asking, please go away. But they kept coming because, playing in his garden was just the best thing. It was the best garden in the neighborhood. But he was doing a research at the time about rewards. So what he tried as an experiment was rewarding them for coming to play in his garden. It's the opposite of what you might expect. So he started out giving them money. He said, if you come and play in my garden, I'll give you $10. So the kids were like, well, that's fantastic. We already love playing in your garden. And now you're saying you're also going to give us money? Well, fantastic, And then bit by bit, one day later or two, he would say, okay, now I'll pay a little dollars. And they were like, okay, fine, still good. Well, you can see where this is going. He kept lowering it $1 at a time until he got to, let's say, $2 or something. And then the kids came to him and said, look, we had a meeting with the kids, $2, that's not going to cut it anymore. So we're not going to come and play in your garden anymore until you pay us $10 again, because that's what we really want right now. So what he did is by giving rewards and then taking them away, which actually happens, right? If you have a class and you give them rewards, but then your class stops, nobody keeps giving your kids rewards or your students. They lost all intrinsic motivation they had beforehand. So not only do you take away their rewards, you take away, their inner drive to play there. So that's an unintended consequence. And Alfie Kohn has written this fantastic book about it, where he basically says that reward and punishment are the, two sides of the same coin. And he argues that a focus on performance and rewards in education is paradoxically making students less motivated to learn. And I'm saying paradoxically because I think we all really like to think that rewards people, no matter what I am telling you now. This is what we've always heard over and over again. But his research, he researched many academic works, proved the following. When school is all about achievement and rewards, students learn that it must be a chore then, because if you basically have to give me rewards for it, then in itself it's probably not very enticing. So I already start considering it, looking at it as something that probably needs rewarding, otherwise you wouldn't do it by yourself. So that's a danger. The second one is, if I want to get rewards, then not getting my rewards is basically going to be punishment, right? if I don't do well, I get punished by not getting the reward. That's why it's two sides of the same coin. So, what am I going to do if I really want that reward or I don't want to be punished? I'm going to play it safe, right? So, I'm going to avoid any challenging task. I'm going to do the minimum effort that can still guarantee me the reward. And it has another side effect, especially if these rewards are also awards, which only one person can get, right? As Alfie Kohn said in a very nice way, awards are simply rewards that most of the class can't get. So they're competitive. That leads to students regarding each other as obstacles to success, to the reward. So that is quite a big danger, because if that's the default, I'm going to consider students that may a bit slow in learning not worthy of my help. I'm going to avoid them because they are going to slow me down. Question is, do we want this in education? Now, the research is there. How do we deal with this? These unintended consequences of rewards, punishment, and competition. To sum them up, so the unintended consequences we have to look into. Games may limit our mental models if they're full-blown serious games. Visual game elements don't cut it. It looks nice, but that doesn't really make it more engaging structurally. And some game elements will backfire. So not all game elements are created equal, or let's say have an equally good impact on the learning abilities of our students. So these unintended consequences, how do we get here? Like why did we allow these things to happen? Why, if it is proven that this doesn't work, are we applying it everywhere around us? Why can I find so many examples of this? And my analysis is that there is often no real examining and understanding of things like, for instance, intrinsic motivation. I mean, yes, in the academic world, but this is not only happening in the educational context, right? Humans are quick to jump to solutioning. It's our nature. I myself like to do that as well. But the real solutions can only emerge from truly understanding the issue. And so this examining and rethinking is what I consider integral to game thinking. So now, what is game thinking? Game thinking is rethinking non-game contexts from the perspective of game design. So we're looking through the lens of a game designer. In other words, if we frame education as a game, how can we make it more fun, fair, and engaging? And this is the question that I want to now answer together with you. Because at the end of this talk, I not only want you to understand what works and doesn't work, but I also would really like to do some thoughts experiments with you of how we can do this in a whole new way. Now, how can we do this? Let's look at this gamified course overview that we just looked at, and in which the game dimension is purely visual, right? Now let's rethink it using game thinking. Let's immediately apply it. So from the perspective of a game designer, I immediately start to associate this game with a game like Angry Birds. I'm sure many of you have played or seen it. And in Angry Birds, once you've passed a level with just 1 star, as you can see in this example, I passed a few levels, I could just proceed to the next level, but I can also later revisit those earlier levels. And since I have become much better at the levels later on, going back to the ones that I only had 1 star suddenly feels very easy. And this is really nice because it makes me very, very proud of my progress. Oh, level 4 was like, I couldn't get it to get 3 stars, but now that I've progressed, I can see the puzzle, right? I can see what I did wrong. I can see a new dimension. And I think that is really great. And sometimes it gives me that confidence of like, hey, I can do something. I am able to deal with this. That is needed to take on those much harder levels later on. If I see this, then as a game thinker, I am immediately thinking, what if we could do an assignment once more later on to get a better grade for it? Isn't it interesting that someone who does not score sufficiently on a test must always redo it, but that someone who barely passes but does pass the test is not allowed to try again to get a better grade later on? I find it I find that quite strange. And I have in fact applied this in class where I gave students the option to redo a test they had already done and passed at. And so, even though not all students were interested in redoing a past assignment, some students did. And they said they felt they had truly mastered it this time. And instead of just learned about it and I forgot about it again, they felt now more confident in their abilities. They better understood what they understood, so to speak. And they learned about learning, which is an even better dimension, which is to say, they understood that different problems need different strategies, and they had understand now a better understanding of, let's say, the collection of strategies that they had at their disposal, instead of just doing whatever was needed and then forgetting about it. And so there are many more ideas we can borrow from games that we can use to rethink education on a more structural level this way. So again, a game thinker uses this knowledge of how games are designed, and from that perspective, a game thinker will then examine, question, and reimagine education, which can be summed up, this specific one, in this card that I created, Skip Challenge. How can learners skip a certain challenge and later revisit it when feeling more skilled or confident? At the bottom of this, I always put some examples of other games that offer this in some sort of variety as well. And this is maybe also interesting to mention the way that I help people, organizations, schools, but also companies do this in my consultancy and workshops is by offering a deck of game design lenses to education, but it can also be applied to work. So if you book a session with me, I'll make sure that when you're not an avid gamer yourself, or maybe you even think of yourself as somebody who hates games, you can still immediately apply the most interesting ideas from the best games in the world, because I've already done all the research for you. So now that you have a basic idea of what game thinking means and how it can be applied, at least the way that I define it, there's many different people with different definitions of game thinking, but I like to think of it this way. Let's go back to the why. Why should we game think at all? Now, I think I can speak for most of us when I say that we all love it when learners, out of their own volition, are curious, they examine things, they research, they experiment, they ask smart questions that make you curious as well. Like, oh, I haven't thought about it that way. And so when we have a positive impact on their learning, on their willingness to learn, then we suddenly see they seem to be having fun. They really enjoy themselves, their capacities, their discoveries, without even adding a funny little, whatever, smiley add on. They just enjoy the process of learning itself, the mastery that's included in it. And when that happens, that's fantastic. That's when we all feel like this. And, it happens. And it is a great feeling. But the reality is, it doesn't always work out that way. So the truth is, I know as teachers, we have become highly suspicious of someone introducing yet another learning method or tool that will boost student engagement, because all we're hearing really is paperwork. So I think this meme sums it up pretty good. And there's other thing. I just found some memes online, and they immediately connected with me because I immediately understood what these issues were. So let me show you another one. This one. So what is this saying? We know there are clear limitations. We cannot provide tailored study programs for each individual student, differentiated learning, as they call it, and still be expected to use standardized tests. It doesn't make sense. And we simply don't have the time to figure out how to make that work, how to make those two things, those two opposites match. So that's an issue we cannot ignore. And there's a third one I want to share with you. So even if we actually get to spend time in class with the students instead of doing all this paperwork then we're constantly reminded that most students don't care about all the work we do outside the classroom. They just care about what happens in the classroom. And in general, I don't know if this is true for everybody, but I sometimes have this feeling, they're not self-motivated, and they're certainly not there to make you feel good about yourself. They just want to get the best grade for the least amount of work possible. That's usually how it feels for a teacher. And so saying students are self-motivated doesn't mean that they always show self-motivated behavior. So to sum it up, these three things that I want to talk to you about. We cannot master this ever-changing demand for new learning methods and software. We just don't have the time for it. We cannot create tailor-made lesson plans for individual students and then still, do standardized tests. And we cannot force students to be self-motivated. You cannot make somebody motivated, no matter how hard you try. So here's 3 thought experiments that I want to do with you to see how we can deal with these 3 issues and find a possibility space to create engaging education without ignoring these very specific obstacles. All right, so here we go. 3 thought experiments. Challenge number 1, and I would love to invite you to come up with your own ideas during this part of the presentation. Write them down on a piece of paper, put them in the chat, whatever you like, and then maybe at the end of the presentation, we can hear some of the ideas that came up, or maybe in the chat session after the presentation. Challenge number 1, what if the student becomes the game master? Because if we have to do all the work, what if the students do all the work? What if we hand over control to the students? Gives us less work. We have to master less stuff. They have to master certain stuff. Does that make sense? It does, actually. One example of a game that we can use as inspiration I want to show you here is one that I already showed in the introduction when I told you that I consulted on this one and also helped on the design. I should explain what this game is about first. So this is a game for 10 to 15-year-old kids, and they have to discuss moral dilemmas. You could safely say this is a serious game, right? It's it has entertaining game-like features, but the purpose is to have a critical dialogue about everyone's moral, standpoint, and to have an open dialogue about it. And this one does not have a built-in morality system. It doesn't tell you what's right or wrong behavior. It merely asks the students to, share perspective on this. And it has some situation cards with different levels of difficulty. For instance, there's a kid in school and he's wearing a knitted sweater from his mother. And, kids are bullying him for it. And he's your best friend. So the question is always then, what would you do? What would you do if this was the situation you're in? Now, there's a game master, and this always starts with one student at random. And he can decide on which situation we'll play, and therefore also choose a difficulty level. And even more interesting, he can decide on how the other students are going to express themselves, like give answer to this question. They can either tell it, act it out, perform it, or draw it. Now, you must understand, in this age group, they love actually role play, like acting things out. It's amazing to see them do it. So, and if they don't know, they just shake a coin in that lid of the game, and then they do whatever comes out, which is also a fun way to use your packaging, by the way. So the game master has quite a bit of control over the difficulty, the context of the situation that they want to discuss, and the way that the others are going to participate. Now, once all the answers are in, the students hand back their, act out or give their drawing or explain what they would do. And then the game master has to decide who wins, so to speak. Now, interestingly enough, when we tested it for 1 year in 3 different schools. We found that this idea of winning was not working for many reasons. But one of them was that kids would just hand over the gold coin, which you won, to their best friends all the time. So they would just keep moving the gold coin between themselves, and the other kids would never win. It had nothing to do with how great their answer was just like, friends helping each other out to be the game master. So we tried to disrupt that pattern, and what we introduced was silver coins. And there's a couple of silver coins, but only one gold coin. So the game master coin goes to whoever gave the best, let's say, content-wise answer. The answer that was the most intriguing, as in, wow, that is a really interesting thought. Then so they would hand over the gold coin to one person, and that person would be the next game master for the next round and be able to decide how the game gets to be played. But there also has to be a silver coin given to the person that has the nicest way of expressing themselves, like the nicest drawing or the funniest act, or the funniest dramatic way of telling it. And sometimes they would overlap, but we just made the rule you have to give one gold and one silver coin to several people. Now you can hear already quite a few game mechanics in here that are quite intriguing. But what I really want to talk to you about right now is the fact that these game master rights, having the gold coin. Oh, sorry, forgot to mention. So if you collected one silver coin, that meant nothing. But if you got 2 silver coins, you could at any time, this was a choice, overrule the person with the gold coin and hand in the 2 silver coins to the bank and take the gold coin and become the game master. So this disrupted this pattern of people passing each other the gold coin. Anyway, so the idea is that kids really loved that these coins weren't meant as points, which buys them nothing, but these represented game master rights. And they just loved this idea that in this way the game master role rotated. They all wanted to be the game master so bad. The teacher is the game master. And this is the point I'm trying to make. What if the students can be the game master for a change? They thought it was fantastic to feel that control, to feel that power in a way, but within the constraints of the rules of the game, of course. So the question would be there that I would like to challenge you to think about. In what ways can learners win the right to alter a class rule? Maybe just temporarily. How can you do that? Any ideas? Just note them down. A colleague of mine actually did this once as an experiment. It was fantastic. He had a 7-week course, and each week another student would prepare a new rule for the class, which would not be announced beforehand unless people needed to bring an object or something. One example was everybody had to lie under the table for the entire class. So teacher as well. Everybody was just lying underneath their tables and staring at the underside of the desk. And this was apparently very exciting for them. And even though not all these rules turned out to be, let's say, as much fun or let's say efficient for learning as this one did, but actually what did happen was that the students felt ownership, they felt surprise, they felt curiosity what's going to happen next. And most important of all, the students did all the preparation. And all the teacher had to do was show up and then improvise. How am I going to teach whatever I'm going to teach in this new situation? And that meant that the teacher was experiencing, alternate learning modes and understanding what made students eager to learn or not eager to learn. Like, for instance, always sitting instead of lying down has a big impact on learning. I won't go into it right. Imagine that that this does something to the way you perceive information. The fact that you're not looking at each other, but you're looking at the ceiling, for instance, where your imagination can run much more free and you're not distracted by people, passing little notes around. So it's quite exciting. And very importantly, after class, they would then collectively reflect on the class. Like, did this rule, what did this do? Did it improve our learning or not so much? It was quite exciting. And very simple. I mean, the curriculum was still the same. It was just the mode of teaching that was changed. Another challenge. What if students can choose their own difficulty level? I mean, we just talked about that we cannot make custom learning plans for each individual students. But what if they have this power to choose or to customize their own experience? And for that, I want to share with you something that is just fantastically, is just brilliant. I'll tell you who invented this after this first slide. So, what we see here is a bar, right? It's this idea, like, for instance, in physics class, that there's two poles in a bar, and kids, you know this game, I'm sure you have to try to jump over it or go under it, whatever. Maybe if you do the what is that called, the lambada? But anyway, you have to jump over it. And as soon as you can't, you're out of the game. And they keep raising the bar until the last kid is left standing, and that's the big winner. But that also means that there's one winner, but not only that, there's 29 losers. Unintended consequence again here is that those who actually need the most practice jumping get the least opportunity to do so, because as soon as you jump over, you get to go again and again and again. As soon as you can't, you got to stop, and you can no longer try. And this professor, Muska Moston, very interesting name, you can see it here at the bottom right, he developed something called the slanty line theory. It's a very elegant, simple theory, which was to say, why don't we make a slanted bar and give the students the opportunity to jump over the bar at the point which suits them best, which they feel most confident in doing. And then the students can set their own challenge. And this is, of course, a metaphor. It's not only for physics education, this can be applied to any form of mental challenge as well. And so his belief is that all children have a right to participate in activities at their own ability level, and that children will not continue activities in which they are continually eliminated or have to wait their turn, but given opportunities that children will seek out challenges and take risk. And we already talked about how students might actually avoid risk. Well, this actually invites them to take risk and to seek out challenge. Interestingly enough, this looks very familiar. And so for those of you familiar with the idea of flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, which is the theory of optimal experience, optimal performance, just look at this. I won't go too deep into this, but it's basically this idea that people that are in a state of flow, everything is just right, where they feel the right kind of challenge and where they feel, super motivated by themselves, is when the amount of skill they have is balanced out with the challenge that is given to them or that they have chosen to take on. And as you can see, if the challenge would be too high and their skill too low, you get kids that are anxious. If the challenge is too low, then very high skilled students will be bored out of their mind. So you want to get them into that sort of flow channel, so to speak. Now let's overlap these. Here we see the in the traditional sense. That means that some students might get into the flow of this. The bar can move up a little bit and they might still be in flow. But as soon as it starts going up, a lot more kids are going to start to get very anxious. And that winner, he might get into the flow, but also for a long time, he might be bored until it really gets interesting, he or she. So that brings us to this interesting idea that you can overlap them, right? We can put this slanted bar on top of the flow and say, create your own flow. So again, condensed into one card, how can you allow learners to choose or adjust the difficulty level of an activity so that it better matches their current skill, energy, or courage? So that would be my challenge to you. How could you give your learners the opportunity to take the challenges that you have in mind for them, all of the challenges from easy to hard over time, and allow them to choose their own difficulty level over time, of course. All right. A third one, a third challenge, thought experiment. We were talking about punishment and reward and how it can backfire. So what if punishment and reward are not part of the game? We just leave them out. Does that mean that nothing works anymore? I mean, I know a lot of people that say games are only fun if they're competitive. And they're only fun if I can win something. And I don't agree. Why don't I not agree? Because when you look into what motivates players in games specifically, there's a lot more there than just achievement and competition. So these are the 10 motivation cards that I usually use in workshops to get people to evaluate. And this you definitely will want to see in full screen. So you might need to click on your top right arrow thingy. If we just rule out here competition and achievement, see what we are left with. We've got people that love to express themselves. We got people that just really love to collaborate. We got people that just want to belong to a group. It's the people that play Monopoly not because they want to win, but because they just want to have a good evening with everybody, having fun. They don't care if they lose. There's people that want to connect. Games can be ways that you are suddenly playing with somebody you don't know and you make new friends. Some people just really like to explore. Again, they don't really like to win or compete. They just want to figure out what happens if I play, football backwards. Immersion. Some people just really want to get that whole feeling of it, the maximum, be saturated with all their senses into this experience. And then some people, play games actually just to not have to think about daily life. And of course, improvement is still there. I mean, achievement does not rule out improvement. So people do like to learn and develop and upgrade themselves, like with the slanty bar. But it doesn't always mean that they necessarily want to win or gain, winner status. That those are two different things that are usually confused to be one and the same thing, but they're not. So when we look at what motivates people, players in this case, we can choose to leave these two out and then discuss how we can involve the other players. So maybe take a few seconds and look at this and go like, all right, if I had to pick two cards for myself, so you yourself as a player or as a teacher or as a manager or maybe even as a student or all three, what are the two cards that are typically the things that motivate you? Would you be able to pick two? Three is fine as well. I mean, it's not can change the rules of the game here, but pick two. And then try to imagine for yourself now or later on, how would I redesign an activity to match those specific motivations? And you will find that you can do a lot of fun things then. Now, I just want to go and look at one example here. And it's important to mention that, I don't believe in player types. This is easily confused with player type theories like Bartels or Nicole Lazaro or Marshevsky, Yuka Chow, all gamification gurus. Amy Jo Kim, player types, she used social actions. I got a bit inspired. You will see some of her cards there as well. But it's important to mention that I don't believe people are always the same. Depending on the context, people have different needs. So if I'm late for an airplane and I'm going to be an achiever, I want to achieve getting my flight. But if I have enough time on my hands, I might be an explorer, see what's going on at the airport. So depending on context, or for instance, I might be really much into playing tic-tac-toe, but once I know how to play it, that doesn't excite me anymore. So then I might have other reasons to keep playing the game. For instance, to bond with my 7-year-old son, even though the game itself, the winning is clearly, I let him win. So, um, all right, an example of something that actually I talked about, points, badges, leaderboards, and don't get me wrong if you think I'm against points, badges, leaderboards per se. I just mentioned that there are unintended consequences when they lead to competitiveness, when they lead to the fear of missing out of rewards, or when even worse, they can be punishing when they are negative incentives. But we can actually rethink badges and even points and leaderboards, because in the example of the Switch game, the points that you could earn were rethought of as game master rights, not as points to save up till whenever. So badges. This is a game called When My Time Comes, and it was designed by one of my associates, Jennifer Coomer. And as part of her master's degree at Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences, where I also teach, and this game facilitates online training of so-called death doulas. So these are professionals who assist in the dying process. You may never have heard of this before. I surely didn't. And it's much like a midwife does the birthing process, but a death doula helps families cope with death through recognizing it as a natural and important part of life. And the players take turns coming up with answers to a set of question cards. And after that, the player gets feedback from all the players. So, for instance, what would you do on your last day? That sort of a question. He would give an answer, or she would give an answer, and then everybody would give feedback. Like, what do they think about that? I remember one player, for instance, I was in the test run, that said, "I don't want anybody to cry on my on my last day," and the feedback was basically like, "How can you demand that? We also need to express ourselves." It's quite interesting discussions coming from that. Now, the feedback that the people can give to the person answering the question can sometimes be quite technical, because this is used to also train death doulas. And so they're very well aware of the costs of a coffin or lunch or whatever. So they might have technical feedback. And when everybody starts to give technical feedback, the discussion isn't rich enough. So the way that we thought of fixing this is that it should be motivated that all the people give feedback in a different way. So how do you do that? Because you cannot force them to do that. And the way to do it is to create these peer badges, where that person would give a badge as a token of appreciation to everybody giving feedback. At least one. You should give one. Nobody misses out on that. But then you have to decide what sort of qualities that person had that helped you better understand what you should be doing in the of your life. So, the consultant might be the one that gave the most practical advice, but then somebody might have very creative ideas. So, for instance, one idea of the crying thing was like, why don't you make a separate tent where people are allowed, a safe place where people are allowed to cry? So, this has quite a few good effects, intended outcomes, which is that the players take that. Well, first of all, the person answering the question will have to really listen to all the feedback. Otherwise, he or she cannot qualify what kind of feedback they think that was, how it was valuable to them. Second of all, the other players start seeing the different kind of feedback other people give and might think, oh, if everybody is going to be giving practical advice, why don't I challenge myself to give some other type of feedback? So the notion here is to make badges specifically into peer badges. And the question, the trigger here is the game lens. What variety of badges can learners give to each other to specify the type of value that they have gained from each other's contribution? Again, something to contemplate. How could you apply that in your own practice? Now, I see that we're already at the end of the presentation, which is great because I only had 1 or 2 slides left. And so I want to leave you with what I consider my mantra, which is if a game isn't worth playing, change it. So if we see some unintended consequences of whatever it is that we're doing in this game education, change it. See what happens, rethink it, you know, but be critical. Evaluate the unintended consequences. Look for ideas from games that can help overcome it or rethink it, reframe it, and then redesign it. And as far as I am concerned, I want to therefore end this presentation by giving you a license to change. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Bruno. That is so great. I want to use that in my marketing today, if I could, for the event. I love that. I love the mantra. It's so good. Let's see. I see some Q&A here. Where can we find Switch Game?
Well, yes, it was developed a couple of years ago, so the city library itself doesn't sell it anymore. But I happen to have a couple of boxes still in the attic with these games. So if anybody's interested, just send me an email, bruno@playspace.cc, and yeah, I could.